What I think we'd like to do, is we have so little time left, is ask our panelists to come on up to the front. And we have a whole bunch, because we thought a lot of you would like to comment. So Dr. Thaut, Dr. Zatorre, and Schlaug, and Janata. And also we have Tara Helen O'Connor, a flutist, who's been involved with the Chamber Music Festival for many years, and Michael RUSINEK, a clarinetist from the Pittsburgh Orchestra, the Pittsburgh Symphony, excuse me. And Suzanne Hanser, who many of you haven't met yet, who drives the music therapy education programs at the Berklee College of Music. So there's not probably enough chairs, but we'll crowd up there anyway. And I want to start, as people are getting settled, to see if there are questions for Dr. HEATON as we get going. No questions. Yes, please.
Is there a theory as to why autism is more common in boys? This is osteoporosis.
So Pamela, the question, is it true that autism is more common in males, and if so, do we understand why?
I think all neurodevelopmental disorders are more common in males, as I understand.
All what is more common in males?
All neurodevelopmental disorders, I believe.
Is that true?
I think, well, that's
Wow.
what...
Is it the XY? The XY factor?
Yeah, that's what people speculate.
Wow. That's something I did not know.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Michael said that's true.
All neurodevelopmental disorders are more
41,
common
yeah.
in males.
Yeah.
So that extra X chromosome is helpful? Is it the absence of the X or the presence of the Y?
Yeah, because...
Do we know? Do we know? Is it gene imprinting then, in the absence of the X or the presence of the Y, or we don't know that kind of science yet, probably? Yes, Lisa Wong.
Of autistic children playing music and that use of their emotions through their music, or is it all? Because your studies are more passive learning.
No, we've just done. There are several studies of autistic savants doing musical improvisation, and we've just done a study of a child doing a musical transposition study, because today I focus very much on the emotional aspects of musical understanding, but there's quite a big literature. We've done quite a lot of research looking at the more cognitive aspects of music perception in autism, and there seems to be sort of features like they seem to get key structures extraordinarily easily. So once a child learns a piece, for instance, in C major, they often seem to be able to transpose it into other keys more easily than a child with a very similar level of pianistic ability. We don't know why, and it's actually a single case study, so we need to run it out with a group. But it's quite consistent with their abilities in mathematics and other kinds of domains, I think.
So Pamela, if I understood the first part of your talk, that an autistic child or individual can have better auditory cues, perhaps, rather than visual cues, is that true or no in terms of interpretation of emotional states? Did I understand you correctly?
No, because when we've done studies of voice perception of emotions in voices, we actually get exactly the same kind of percentage correct as they do with Ekman faces. So we recently did some studies using Sophie Scott UCL has produced some nice visual stimuli that have been tested and they're universal. They've been tested with the Himba in Africa, and they recognise that they're sad, happy, etc. And when we use those, we do get the same effects with the Ekman faces as with those voices. So I think the deficit is very, very similar across both modalities. To answer the second part of the question, there's quite a lot of theorising that people with autism have got enhanced perceptual discrimination. And that probably explains things why they have more perfect pitch, and that they're very good at learning about key structures and those kinds of things.
So let's go to our panel and kind of do what we did this morning, and maybe we'll start with Dr. Thaut and ask you to comment on the lectures this afternoon or thoughts, and let the audience also continue to ask questions of our panelists, and we'll work downstream.
Okay, is this on? Okay. Well, I just start with a brief comment to give room for everybody and the audience. I think all four speakers made some excellent, very important points about what I maybe would call the topic of music learning in general. And that I really mean in the broadest sense, from the childhood development, the young, early brain, all the way to where the brain came from, in the modern human brain came from in development, and why the arts have always played such a tremendous role. And actually, artistic artifacts of artistic sophistication precede anything else in terms of other technology or cultural achievements. The human brain hadn't figured out a wheel 50, 60,000 years ago, but they figured out how to build modern flutes in modern artworks. So the question is, of course, one could say sarcastically, well, the arts were just a little easier to figure out than the rest. Or one could actually argue, and I would say I would see quite a bit of evidence in the speakers this afternoon, that maybe the arts were a cognitive laboratory of learning how to think abstractly and symbolically for the first time. And that was the necessary foundation for all other developments. And maybe if I then refer more specifically to our developmental speakers this afternoon, don't we see that sort of almost ontogenetically again in a young child? That actually the play phase, what we call art or destroying wallpaper with crayons, is actually the necessary development for the kid to think abstractly and learn how to read and write and do math. That's my short comment.
I have an even shorter comment, I think, which is that what all these really great presentations we heard had in common was trying to look at the relationship between mechanisms or systems that are engaged for music and systems that are engaged for other domains of cognition or emotion. So whether it be language or whether it be perception or in the social sphere. And I guess my comment is that it may perhaps be useful to try to keep in mind that there is not necessarily any one underlying explanation for these relationships. Because if I'm thinking, for instance, of why musical training may enhance the perception of speech and noise, well, that could have to do with something like the brainstem responses that we've heard about. Whereas if I think about why music might enhance emotion and or give an avenue for expression of emotion in certain populations, it may have to do with a completely different system. So we might just keep that in mind, that what we really need to understand are the mechanisms behind these phenomena, and that just because music may have lots of effects doesn't mean that there is one underlying sort of big explanation. That's my 2 cents.
I found the afternoon talks as good and similar good as the morning talks. I mean, there's a lot of new and very interesting information. I thought I was going to give the audience a few more things to think about, since it came up a few times that music might have these extra musical benefits. One thing that is frequently not thought of is that when we learn to play musical instruments, we actually also learn other things that might be beneficial, such as learning to learn, having an interaction with another teacher that is a one-on-one interaction. Where do we have that in the school? We only really have that in these kinds of extracurricular activities when we learn a musical instrument. We learn to be motivated, it is emotional. So there are all these extra factors that are difficult to actually measure, that potentially could have an effect, not just on the close association between music and language, but also in other cognitive domains. So that's one thing that I think we all should think about when we talk about the cognitive effects of music training. There's also one thing that I always challenge. I'm a firm believer in having an enriched cultural environment and having individuals do music. But I'm very cautious about individuals that only do music, because if you actually think that music makes you smarter and that music has all these effects on math, we would really expect to find professional musicians when they're in their 40s and their 50s that they're the smartest around. And I'll ask you, just like think about this, whether or not that's true or not true. I think I'll stop here.
I'd like to make a couple of comments that I hope can be clarifying and synthesizing. So one is regarding the point of spared musical memory in Alzheimer's and whether or not there's an ability to learn new melodic and verbal material and to associate them. And as opposed to having spared memory from one's past. And I think it's really important in this discussion to distinguish between different types of memory systems, and one being the capacity to learn to associate novel material, which, as Isabel illustrated, is impaired compared to normals, and which has been shown by other researchers also that there simply is no spared benefit there. But that's very, very different than looking at really long-term episodic memory. Okay, so it uses completely different mechanisms in the brain, and the ability to trigger and retrieve memories that are 20, 30, 40 years old may well be spared. And and so this gets to the question of musical memory and sort of the second point. And that has to do with the sheer amount of rehearsal that we have for this music from our past, so familiar songs. And it actually gets back to this question of earworms. If you think about a song fragment that's stuck in your head and that replays over and over, really what you're doing, annoying as it may be, is rehearsing that melodic and verbal material over and over and over and over again. So the effective amount of training on this material, be it because you hit play, play, play on the same song over and over again in your youth, or because it got stuck in your mind and it's replaying in your mind, that's much more training than what's delivered in these experiments looking at associations. I mean, even if you're training twice a week for 3 months. And that brings up this interesting point, this relationship between music and movement and rhythm, and social interaction, which has come up multiple times today. And in relation to that point, I'd like to just make a point about some functional organization of the brain. This has really been espoused quite a bit by Joaquin Fuster, a neuroscientist at UCLA, one of the pioneers for our understanding of the organization and functions of the prefrontal cortex. And the basic point he makes is that the front half of the brain is important for action and the back half is important for perception. And of course, they're always interacting in this perception-action type of cycle that we heard about earlier today. But the important point is that there's actually a gradient of organization along the medial prefrontal cortex that runs from the ventral medial prefrontal cortex all the way back here, which has to do with specificity of action. So up front here in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, that's very important for just general large-scale motivation. And so that's where you have all these emotional tie-ins. And as you go further and further back, you have ever greater specificity of action. So you ultimately encounter the pre-supplementary motor area and the supplementary motor area that helps structure our action sequences. Now, about halfway up are some of the regions that I was showing and suggesting are involved in music-evoked memories, but also very important in social cognition, and they're immediately adjacent to regions that mediate conflict, when there's conflict in action. And if you think about social interaction, a lot of that is about actually minimizing conflict. So if you think about synchronous movement, synchronous action, that's a state of minimized conflict, whereas asynchronous movement is a greater state of conflict. Regardless, with social interaction, then it's no surprise that you would have these social functions and socio-emotional functions that are essentially overlaid in these brain areas that are also important for structuring action in general, and may help now link these ideas of music, movement, and social cognition.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers who are specializing in music as a model for their own particular vocabulary and specialties, and the vocabulary that we're learning from Dr. Patel with this transformative technology of mind is such a beautiful model for understanding so many concepts, including this adaptive plasticity that has such great implications. With Dr. Peretz, we're learning to really document those outcomes that are robust and those that are not. Very important, again, to the future of a research agenda. With Dr. Trainer, we're reminded of the power of music, certainly early in life, and how critical these connections can be. And with Dr. Heaton, a potentially very strong musical emotion induction as a way to not only understand these very challenging issues in autism and in alexithymia and other related disorders, but in all of us who, as we look at our social relationships. So I'm really struck with one of the first comments by a panelist this morning, Mark Nykrug, who talked about his mother and the cello, and you can feel how that fetus must have been affected deeply. And with the advent of accessibility of music and our plugging into our earphones or our earbuds, those moms are no longer giving the benefit to those fetuses in utero. And the family creation of song around the piano perhaps being less so. Dr. Schlaug, your points about the implications for music research and what those things entail. I fear, as much as I'm encouraged by these researchers, I really fear today's status of music, not to mention, as Dr. WILLMAN suggested, the dearth of music education in our schools and the implications long-term for what that means, not only for those of us who sadly may develop Alzheimer's disease and will have less of a repertoire to build on, but for all of us in the quality of our lives.
Well, I play clarinet in the Pittsburgh Symphony, and I have to say that in preparation for concerto appearances or audition competitions that I've done, I have had anxiety dreams that put me in this very scenario that I'm in right now. And I certainly will probably prove the point that, if I may say, my colleague made, that professional musicians are not the smartest people in the room. But I just came in the last half hour of the talks this afternoon, and I find them very fascinating. And I find it very interesting because, I mean, my life is spent looking at music and trying to figure out what those notes mean and how best to play them. And I'm sure a lot of you have studied music and read music, but your lives are devoted to taking music and seeing what it does to the brain and how it can help people. And I find it incredibly fascinating and just amazing how mysterious the brain is and how much we know and how little we know at the same time. One thing that we've been involved in the Pittsburgh Symphony that some of you may find interesting is that we've been involved in kind of a pioneering effort in music and wellness. And there are people in our organization that have partnered with the various local universities and also the Children's Hospital to use musicians from the orchestra to go into the hospitals and play music for families and patients as a way of reducing stress, anxiety, reducing reliance on medical pain remediation, and other sorts of things. And this is a program that has been going on for a few years and is really mushrooming and growing at a fast pace. And if any of you are interested in what we're doing and think that you may be able to adopt and adapt in your local scenes, feel free to get in touch with me and I can put you in touch with various people. But I'm totally fascinated by what you're doing. And you know, I could put my own personal stamp and talk to you about the power of music in my own life in terms of what it has done. About a decade ago, my father had a pretty serious stroke, and he was laid out completely out of touch from the world. And I remember my brother and I were in the room with him, and we around the clock, just trying to be with him, playing his favorite music, some of his favorite songs, and one of his favorite singers is Jacques Brel. And we were in the room, and he was, I mean, he couldn't talk. It was pretty bad. And this one Jacques Brel song came on, and he threw up his arm and started singing along. And it was this song that brought him out of it. And I mean, what was going on in his brain at that point, who knows? But the power of music to sort of bring him out was amazing to watch. And you people could tell me exactly what happened. But anyway, thanks.
Hi. My name is Tara O'Connor, and I'm a flutist, and I am a product of music in the schools. My parents were incredibly supportive of my music interest when I was a kid, and when it came time to choose an instrument in I guess 4th grade, I chose the flute, and I really attribute a lot of my ability to focus and concentrate and learn quickly from that intense musical training that I had as a child and that I still continue to do. And I think it's fascinating, this, I went to the talk last night, it was amazing, and like Michael today, I came in this afternoon, and hearing about rhythm and the effects of rhythm and help with infants, I thought that was absolutely fascinating, how infants are more apt to help if they've been synchronized, and I think that's really a wonderful thing. I too had an uncle who had brain cancer, and he lived for a very, very long time, for 7 years, which was really very unusual for the type of cancer that he had. And I would also play for him at his bedside and also in the hospital, and they would bring people in from the ward, and he was not able to speak towards, I guess, the last 3 years of his life, but he was able to communicate through music and with humming and with touch, and I found that to be very emotionally exciting and draining. And I wonder also about, and just in the autism discussion, about not being able to describe an emotion and what that kind of frustration, I wonder if there's been a lot of, I'm sure there has been a lot of study in that, but that's something that I would be very interested in seeing more of as well.
The audience for the panelists or any of the speakers this afternoon. Further comments? Yes.
First of all, I agree with what you've said about this conference. It's been fantastic. I'm an oboist, an orchestral player, and also a professor of music, and obviously have a long and deep interest in music education and everything that is coming together now with the sciences. And my own personal feeling is that we live in an era that we're going to all look back on, if we live long enough, as a renaissance, because the sciences and the arts are really coming back together in a unified way and informing one another's practices. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that we're able to do in this type of a conference. So thank to all of you for that.
Thank you. Additional comments or questions? Are we all tired? Yes, one more?
I wonder if there's any research going on right now that has to do with the specific frequencies of musical tones and how the specific frequencies may
Any of our panelists or speakers this morning want to take that question?
I guess it's my choice then.
I think there are some, there's a desire in sound healing to examine those effects, but because of the complexity that's been discussed here today, it's almost impossible to isolate a single tone and what associations that might have, what the history brings, what the background of the individual is, and what's going through their mind while they are hearing this tone. So again, very difficult to isolate. Therefore, I don't know anything that's been published.
Following up on that, I have a question for Laurel from this morning. I don't know, I don't see, where is she? Ah, there you are. So what blew me away from your talk, I guess I knew this, but to hear you talk about it and think of the effects of music on a 4-month-old or a 6-month-old, and how that early brain is sort of open to tonal or atonal rhythms and has a maybe positive or an equal reaction to all of it, but by 12 months that's gone, made me think of the absence of those stimuli in children. So if you have an infant who's truly deprived and has little human interaction or little environment and sound interaction, what do we know about whether later in life that can be overcome or rebuilt? So is that infant time lost to us? So if we really let a child get 1 or 2 or 3 and they've lost the opportunity for all that social interaction through music or all the other things I can imagine, is it possible to allow them to recover and become normal, or is that truly a lost time?
Yeah. Well, of course, we don't know about total deprivation, but we're learning more and more about what we call windows of plasticity. So, for example, even though by 12 months infants are showing a particular pattern of being better at the rhythms of their culture or the tonal system of their culture than other systems, there still remains a period of plasticity over which they can more easily learn. Now, we know a lot more about this in language. So if you try to learn a second language, so you move to a new place, and you're younger than about 10, you will learn that language very fluently. If you're older than 12 or 13, you will probably always speak with an accent. You'll probably never completely master the syntax. So even though in language as well we can see these effects by 12 months, there's a fairly long window over which things can be still changed. And the other thing I should say is that I think actually one of the most profound findings from the last couple of decades is just how plastic the adult brain is. So I think someone, I forget who it was, in their talk mentioned, was it you, Gottfried, that we used to think that, you know, by 4 or 5 years the brain was set and that was it, and there was no, when you're talking about what is plasticity, there were no more changes possible. We now know the adult brain, you know, even in Alzheimer's disease, there are still plastic processes going on, positive plastic processes going on in the context of the whole degeneration. Otherwise, they couldn't learn anything. So plasticity is a very complex concept, and there are very many aspects of it that we still have to research.
So let me ask you a question about music education in very young children. Is enculturation, or the closing of the brain to just one set of rhythm and harmonies, a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it depends on your goal, right? So if your goal, so for example, we take the rhythm example. If your goal is to create somebody who's very good at the typical Western rhythms, the very simple rhythms, then expose them to those and nothing else. If your goal is to make somebody who can do world music, and I think the musicians up there will tell you that more and more, I think musicians in Western society are called upon to play complex rhythms. So if your goal is to create people with that flexibility, then you need to expose them to complex rhythms early on to make that process easiest. So it really depends on your goal, and I think that's a sort of a whole thing about plasticity and learning and so on. You know, what is good and what is bad. Usually there's no absolute about what is good and what is bad. It depends on what your goal is. And then you give the experience that's appropriate for that goal.
That maybe cultural or ethical or racial biases and prejudices we get set in ways I think that we have been unaware of,
Yeah,
is
I mean,
where I'm
yeah,
going. That
yeah.
if at such an early age we become sort of fixed in our brains to our rhythms, our cultures, our sounds, that suggests almost a limitation in the ability to be more broad.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
we've tended to think of those kinds of cultural biases or ethnic biases as something we learn through behaviors, but actually there's something learned very early. That's what I learned today that really had quite a profound effect
Yeah,
on
just
me.
one final comment on that is we know children who learn 2 or 3 languages when they're young, they may learn the languages slightly slower, but it doesn't hurt them at all, and they can keep the languages separate. We know almost nothing about learning 2 or 3 different musical systems at the same time. As far as I know, that's just never been studied.
Very good point. I think it follows the musical development, musical learning follows the language model. So what we hear, that's what we learn. But you ask about what would happen with a model of deprivation. Well, I think we are living your worst fears every day because we are living in a model of deprivation. There's the status of music education, the understanding of the role of music education is extremely poor. And we are actually, what happens is as soon as the child turns 5 or 6, we're saying, stop with the nonsense. We get our hands on you, now you learn the real thing, which is reading, writing, arithmetic, neglecting the idea that the ability to do that was laid through artistic endeavors that the kid usually did on his own or her own. So I think we're sort of, music sits sort of in the stranglehold, sometimes I feel, between neglect or over-romanticizing. We will love it to death, and it's this cultural artifact, or we completely neglect it and say, it's just not worth anything. And I think we need to take a more logical approach to auditory thinking. Music is a very specific way of thinking auditorily, which is extremely important, extremely useful.
Final question.
I'm Kristen Burkholder. I'm a family doctor in rural Arizona, and I used to be a professional flutist. But we're talking kind of about a single generation, or as you were just speaking, how the effect is on each person. One of the things that Indian Health Service is, a big buzzword in the Indian Health Service right now is transgenerational trauma or historical trauma, and what giving a really poor diet to a mom in the 1950s did to her kid, and what the generational effects of that are in terms of diabetes and changed abilities for cognition. If we stop doing music education in public schools now, or earlier, if we remove the emphasis on importance of that kind of learning, what do we do down the road to future generations? And vice versa, if we provide music to children who wouldn't have had it otherwise, like the program we heard earlier about in Venezuela, how do we change, potentially change society for the better?
Thank you for that terrific comment. So I want to thank all the speakers and panelists for our afternoon session. It was fantastic.